it's very, very complicated, the origins of Arabic, made more complicated by the fact we found over 40,000 pre-Islamic inscriptions in the desert in Arabia. There's a marvelous moment, there's a Professor MacDonald in COVID who did a whole series of wonderful lectures about these so-called tweets that are being turned up more and more in them. And it becomes very, very complicated. It appears that there are about 6 proto-classical Arabic forms going. Some of them are clearly reserved for a spiritual message, some of them for your family. The linguistic element in Arabia is so alive and well, and it's one of the truisms both of the Quran needing to be recited, but that Arabic remains pure because it's a language of people who love language. It's an oral language with people who didn't write. And so time and time again, the Arab language of the desert gets borrowed and used as Syriac, as Aramaic, as other forms, but always it returns to this extraordinary energy of people who do like a language. And you know the Arab world much better than I do, and wherever we've been. Cafes, meeting moments, the absolute delight in witticisms, in the rolling use of the language is still very much.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
But there's been a war going on between the two great empires in the region, between the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, that sort of that grinds down the two great poles of power, and in a way creates a space for the Arabs to move into, but also creates a problem for the Prophet Muhammad while he's trading, because the entire trade then collapses. The incense trade, this trade on which the people from Mecca, for instance, we think of Mecca now as the center of Islam, but at the time they were promoting other faiths. You have the Kaaba, which is now this sort of central image of Islam, but at the time was filled with idols of an image of the Virgin Mary and of all the gods of the region were in there, and religious tourism and this trade in incense going up towards the Mediterranean and Mesopotamian world was the world that the Prophet Muhammad knew, but there was in a way a depression. There was a slowdown in trade, which is partly why he's sitting in a cave.
Indeed, it's very good to be reminded of that. We're not taught in British Indian history the severity of the Byzantine-Persian War. It went on for almost 24 years, and it was a war of total savagery. Anthony is rather modestly hiding his own book, The Nomads, and it is all about cavalry power and Central Asian expansion. And what happened is Byzantium and the Persian Empire had got extraordinarily strong cavalry armies, and for that whole 2 decades, they were trashing each other's communities. So Byzantium was reduced to just the city of Constantinople. The Persian Empire occupied the whole of the ancient Near East. And I was just come back from Turkey last week, and we went to an archaeological site, and you could see very clearly there that the end of the classical world was in 620. This period was intensely destructive. And the frontiers went backwards and forwards, and this was the crisis point, in a way, that sort of summoned up a need for something new. Very, very complicated, because both the Persian Empire backed its own Christian faith community, the Syrian Church, the Church of the East. Orthodoxy was Byzantium. So it was using faiths against each other and constantly moving the frontiers.
I remember a long, long time ago you telling me a story about the Prophet Muhammad meeting a Nestorian monk in Basra.
Bahira, the Reverend, is that famous incident when the Prophet Muhammad was traveling with learning the trade from Abu Talib, his uncle who'd taken over the role of looking after this young boy. And the Bahira is aware that there's something special about this caravan trade, and it has a dinner party arranged to meet everyone there. And in fact, they've left Muhammad, who's then possibly just 8 years old, behind. And eventually he goes, "Are you sure you've invited all your guests?" And they say, "Oh yes, there's Abdul Muttalib's little grandson. We'll bring him." And then Bahira recognizes something extraordinary about his face and his charisma, and takes aside Abu Talib and says, "Watch after this man. This is the future blessing of the world." And that story is in all the Islamic histories and is repeated on another stage when there's a very similar character called Nestor, who is a monk at Bostra. As a young man, I always thought of the oasis being a tiny little dot in the Arabian desert, until I finally got there and then realized that Bostra was the Byzantine military and administrative capital of Syria, and a great vaulted sort of city, which brings it even strong into mind. And yet again, there are multiple cathedrals of rival Christian faiths in that community.
In my Nomads book, I'd consider just for a minute what would have happened if there hadn't been this sort of economic depression. Because the Prophet Muhammad would have been a successful trader, and maybe everything would look very differently. How does Arabia look during this slowdown? I mean, I know that the Prophet Muhammad stops traveling, but does everybody else? Because there's a sense of people in Arabia waiting for something.
There is the backstory is that both the Persian and the Byzantine Empire have got their own client kings. The Ghassanid kings backing the Jacobite Church on the Syrian frontier, and the Lakhmid kings against Mesopotamia and Iraq. So there are these sort of federated bosses with their own spiritual backing. The Lakhmids were very keen on the so-called Nestorian Church, and the Ghassanids were Jacobites. They fought and feuded against each other. So although there's a great war of empires, there's also another sort of border war going on within Arabia. And unlike the rest of the world and India, penetrated by Aryan cavalry regiments, we know that Arabia was never settled by the Aryans. They never needed or never possessed by that alien culture, because the secret of Arabia's birth was when the camel was domesticated around about 1200, 1300 BC, and that expanded Arabia to be a self-sufficient community. And they were never really ruled by other people. So you could have small client kings, but Arabia kept itself sort of very close to itself. I mean, the famous trading cities like Petra then get replaced by Palmyra, and after Palmyra gets destroyed, it's Mecca's turn to sort of run the trade routes, but always on their own terms.
And Mecca was also the place where the tribes gathered once a year for the religious ceremonies that were happening around the Kaaba. This is still before Islam, and you had this great outpouring of culture and most notably poetry, where you have the sort of the jousting of the poets. Can you give us a sense of that? Tell us about that.
There's a tradition that the Kaaba was hung by the winning poets who would be gathered. There were 10 festivals, so-called, in pagan Arabia around the seasons, and Mecca celebrated drawing all the Bedouin tribes in. And also, in quite a complicated way, we can see the elements of the old pagan religion very clearly in Mecca. The worship of the three goddesses, of the fates, the daughters of fate, and also Muzdalifa, strong geographical word, but that was also the title of the thunder god. And we get similar versions of that in Palmyra as well. This own ancient cult of the mother goddess falling in love with her sort of brother son, and him being sacrificed as part of the seasons. And that seems to be in the background of some of the events that were then clarified and purified and turned into the Islamic Hajj. But you've got elements of that emerging.
One of the defining moments of the Prophet's life before the revelation is his marriage to an older woman who is a powerhouse of trade along the incense route. Can you describe what happens with that?
Khadija, famously older than the Prophet Muhammad in all traditions. The Sunni and Shia have got very, very different pictures of her, but she was twice widowed before, and in fact she, through the death of her two previous husbands, was a very wealthy trading woman herself, and had heard good things about El-Amin, Muhammad, the trusty young merchant, and sends him on a test mission to Syria with some goods and some commissions, and sends her freed man to accompany this trader to watch him. And then all the reports are exceeded by his justice, his charity, his complete scrupulousness then. And then she gets someone to just see how he feels about Khadija. And Khadija, of course, is the love of the Prophet Muhammad's life. While Khadija was alive, he took no other women. Later on he had 11 wives, but Khadija gave him all 6 children that he would ever be allowed by God to have, the 2 boys who died young, but the 4 daughters who carried on. And when the Prophet Muhammad was asked to imagine what paradise could offer, he said it would be alone in a palm frond hut with Khadija. And after she died, her sister would often come and be treated with respect by the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. And when you heard Khadija's sister's voice, everybody knew that he was immediately affected, this extraordinary close bond. And I've done perhaps a little too much genealogy into the Prophet Muhammad's life, and realised that Khadija and the Prophet Muhammad were actually third cousins. And they were sort of fully aware and equal of each other. And although Imam Ali is the first male believer, Khadija is the first believer in Islam, the first one to acknowledge the Prophet Muhammad. Because after that terrifying embrace of the Archangel Gabriel in the cave at Hira, he comes home a shattered man, because he comes out and the horizon is famously possessed by vast 365 degree vision of the Archangel Gabriel everywhere around him. And he goes home and shelters with Khadija, thinking that he's become one of the soothsayers possessed by a spirit. And she puts a blanket over his back and said that this is not possible. This is the beginning of something more special and important. And the other absolutely charming thing about Khadija is that she was part of this circle of Hanif, the seekers after righteousness, that included one of her cousins, Waraka. And there were 4 Hanif in the pre-Islamic days of Arabia who were looking at the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, the remnants of Zoroastrian and Mazdaism, examining all the kernels of belief and seeing which way Arabia would go. And of course they were waiting for something that was going to take them by surprise, but they were journeying to every corner of the universe.
So the revelation happens when the Prophet is 40, and he's still in Mecca. At what point does he go to Medina? You've mentioned that he's living in Medina with Khadija.
The revelation is incredibly important, because so many Europeans imagine that the Prophet Muhammad is like a sort of a Christian or a bishop or an archbishop reciting from his pulpit. And it's very, very important, I think, to get hold of the fact that Muhammad was possessed by the Spirit of God through the Archangel Gabriel almost always in domestic environments. Later on, after his death, his wives were quizzed by the early grammarians looking at the Quran, and they were trying to sort out where the recitations happened. And between them, the wives worked out there were roughly 200 events that they collectively, as his trusted female companions, could remember. And each of them, there are Muslims in the audience will know better than me, the Prophet Muhammad explained the process of receiving a recitation. It's like having his soul dragged out of him. And he compares some moments with like the brightness of the dawn, this wonderful sense of enthusiasm of God's love, but at other times like a terrifying internal bell that rang in his head until he properly produced the words to fulfill the Archangel Gabriel's message. And it's very complicated to think that these surah were built up over a pattern of 22 years. I know I'm not answering your question, but and they were right at the end of his life, 3 months before he died, that final revelation at Gardahum. He was working over a verse again and perfecting that line, getting it closer to the final, the sense that the tension had gone and that he delivered the Quran as it was meant to be.
And coming back to the Mecca and Medina thing,
Yes.
some of this, because some surah come from Mecca and some come from the Medina period.
Indeed, no, it's very, very important. So age 40, the first revelation, and then they come short, sharp. No, I shan't read because I think that's cheating. But without doubt, if you're a non-Muslim, the Meccan revelations are the more powerful. There's an absolute sense of the day of judgment coming upon us, the mercy of God, but also that the world is a fragile place and we need to engage in worshipping God as part of the dynamism. And as you all know better than me, the Meccan period is when the Prophet is persecuted, and eventually he has to take refuge in Medina, 10 days ride from Mecca, where he's welcomed into the community who are going to protect him and acknowledge him as a prophet, but not as a leader. He's just there to be honoured as a prophet and to be a judge, someone who can look after the disputes of the clans, but not a political leader. And the Medina revelations are much longer, much more complex, much more about the way that the community, being formed in Medina, is going to police itself and instruct itself. When Muhammad, peace be upon him, fled from Mecca, there were only 82 professed Muslims in Mecca prepared to go to Medina with him. So it's a tiny community then. And we see this growing and emerging with the Medina revelations.
Well, so how does that come about that he not only attracts more people to him, but manages to unify Arabia around his vision and his charisma?
It's a very important. I've been interviewed by Americans. They love the fact that Prophet Muhammad came to Medina with a constitution. Americans love anything to do with the constitution, so they feel very, very happy. And there's not just one; there are two Medina constitutions to make them feel that Islam is something that they can understand and go with. But it is very important to see that the Prophet Muhammad was welcomed into a community on a fully constrained platform of responsibilities, and literally, it's the magic of the Quran. It's the sound of the Quran. And as the Quran is recited through the night, there are, by the end of the Prophet Muhammad's life, there are 25 people who got whole of the Quran in their head. And the whole community are used to reciting through the night, so they know the sound of it. And it's said again and again with the individual conversions of people like Caliph Umar, who was initially, like St. Paul, against the religion. It was the sound of the Quran that did the magic. And we're all so used, me and you are obsessed by, we're producing all these endless books, words, words, words. I know our children complain. But the Quran is not a book. It is a sound. And its power is it is most manifest when it's recited, not read.
That's a lovely idea. But also this language, Arabic, is absolutely central to this initial outpouring of the religion, because unlike any other religion, this is a revelation that is delivered in the local language for the local people.
It's a very good question. Both the Jacobite and the Armenian Church and the Georgian Church and the Church of the East, unlike our own Christian faith where we're obsessed by Latin and Greek, were very good about using the Demotic language. And the so-called Nestorians were, at this period and shortly afterwards, their missionaries were going to Central Asia, going to China, using whatever language. So there is a background in Arabia of people using Demotic speech. It's very, very complicated, the origins of Arabic, made more complicated by the fact we found over 40,000 pre-Islamic inscriptions in the desert in Arabia. There's a marvelous moment. There's a Professor MacDonald in COVID, who did a whole series of wonderful lectures about these so-called tweets that are being turned up more and more in them. And it becomes very, very complicated. It appears that there are about 6 proto-classical Arabic forms going. Some of them are clearly reserved for a spiritual message, some of them for your family. The linguistic element in Arabia is so alive and well, and it's one of the truisms both of the Quran needing to be recited, but that Arabic remains pure because it's a language of people who love language. It's an oral language with people who didn't write. And so time and time again, the Arab language of the desert gets borrowed and used as Syriac, as Aramaic, as other forms, but always it returns to this extraordinary energy of people who do like a language. And you know the Arab world much better than I do, and wherever we've been. Cafes, meeting moments, the absolute delight in witticisms, in the rolling use of the language is still very much part of that culture.
How much time have we got? Excuse me. 15 minutes. Oh, good. So, apart from the language, explain to me how the Prophet Muhammad, with his revelation, with his first band of adherents, manages to bring about the unification of the tribes in Arabia. As we're talking about voices of faith and the unifying power of faith.
When the Prophet Muhammad was persecuted in Mecca, when he goes to Medina, one has to be clear about this, he immediately takes the offensive. This is not a defensive war. The moment he's based in Medina, he starts leading desert raids. He knew the merchant caravan routes, and what he does is concentrate using the Bedouin tribes to try and cripple the old pagan aristocracy of Mecca, who are, like the aristocrats of Britain, very keen on their money and keeping hold of it. And he hits the caravans again and again, shaken off. And the first great battle is trying to intercept the Meccan caravan. In fact, it gets safely, but that is the first pitched engagement. And it is a moment, it takes some time for those who brought up in a Western culture to realize that Muhammad was leading battles, organizing war, organizing over 28 military raids in his life, but always ultimately in order to get people to listen to the Quran. So what's happening is it's military, but it's not bloodthirsty. It's also part of that tradition of the Arab world of total respect and chivalry for the brave man and the protection of women. There's a wonderful story of Rabah, the Arabian pre-Islamic knight, who is escorting a lone woman and her camel and her merchandise across the desert. And he's called out to by brigands, leave the camel and the woman alone, and he absolutely refuses to and goes back again and again to fight off the brigands, breaks his lance, and eventually people are so impressed by his behavior that even his enemies give him another lance in order to defend the woman and his responsibility. And one has to get into that world to order to love the sort of muscular element of warfare, and also compare ourselves to the 7th century descriptions from the Venerable Bede, St. Patrick in Ireland, where you are fighting for your faith endlessly to protect and defend it.
In Nomads, I write about Ibn Khaldun, 14th century scholar, who talks about asabiya, this idea of a sort of unifying force that will bring people together around a charismatic figure and will allow them to achieve much more than even they believed was possible by this group feeling. And one of the people who Ibn Khaldun writes about is obviously the Prophet Muhammad and the rise of not just Islam, but of the Islamic Empire. What is it if the Prophet Muhammad is not a political figure, if he's not a political leader, but is a spiritual leader? What is it about him that allows this gathering of people, this asabiya?
It's a very good question, because the Prophet Muhammad never had a court structure. So he would just, his group of early converts would be given tasks, and they were not ministers and they were not generals. They were given a specific job to do and then discharged. So there was no quasi-imperial, there's no governorships being created, there's no pashaliks. Imam Ali is given his first task to go to Yemen to do a negotiation and to pick up the first charitable tithe. But the moment it's over, he's back to being a normal fellow brother. And the Asabiyya, the strong point of Islam, is this extraordinary egalitarianism. And the Prophet Muhammad was always concerned that the poor had the spiritual virtue. And his prayer at the end of his life is, God, keep me amongst the poor and keep me poor. And so you have this this man who also embraced women as equal spiritual soul possessions, but also had a sort of extraordinary demotic virtue. So as we've described, both the Persian and the Byzantine Empire there were very, very strongly dominated by powerful cavalry generals who really rule the whole world, and would do for several hundred more years. The Prophet Muhammad deliberately turns his back on that element of aristocratic pride, rides a mule, wears the humble clothes of a farmer, does not associate himself with that tremendous trappings. You've seen those carvings in Iran where a Sassanid emperor and his horses and his plumes, it's more than a sort of a knight of Christendom. It's a cast aside. And he is very clear that he neither venerates the swagger of the military or will have anything to do with it. Time and time again, he tests his own community. His own freed slave, Zaid, who he adopts as his son, he gives Zaid the command of the army. So the Arabs, who are obsessed by their genealogy and their tribal battles, had to be led by a freed slave, and they didn't like it. They complained endlessly, and that you got the Prophet Muhammad showing this extraordinary egalitarian gift. And of course, it's a truism. He'd observed in his childhood both the scholarly power of the Reformation of Judaism for the rabbis, but also the role of the priests in these 13 different rival Christian communities. And again, Islam is going to be something completely open to everybody. You don't need a church, you don't need a cathedral, you don't have ushers controlling it. You go to your God yourself in the morning and the evening. And I am, not all of us, but we're obsessed by great mosques and the great beauty that have been created around the world. It's vital to remember the Prophet Muhammad's first mosque was an open courtyard with mud brick walls. Instead of the fantastic minbars you go up to receive a sermon in a great mosque now, as he was getting older, past 60, a convert made the equivalent of a pulpit by digging a hole in the ground and putting a palm trunk. So the Prophet Muhammad could lean, that was his only comfort, could lean while he was giving his sermon. The only architectural embellishment of the mosque, which was also the place where he lived, where it had 11 huts for his wives, where his horses and animals were stabled, was a small lean-to, palm-fronded sort of balcony. And I think it's very instructive for those who get wrapped up in the power of later, and the wealth and the power and structure of the later Islamic empires, to remember just how simple and gorgeously accessible it was, that mosque, where food would be given, where the mosque courtyard would also be a hospital after battles. You have this, and I think my wife, who's a Freudian psychotherapist, says, why are you still continuously obsessed by Islam? What is it? Where is it? And I think in a way the gift that the Prophet Muhammad, even if you're not a Muslim, gives to the world is this extraordinary decency, side by side. You go in I've just been traveling in southern Turkey in Ramadan and seeing the mosques fill up casually, organically, as wealthy merchants stand side by side with a street cleaner. And I've seen children running amok over their elders and betters with balloons. The cheerfulness, the egalitarian element is still a blessing for the world.
That's lovely. I think we've got time for a few questions, if there are any questions. Are there any questions in the audience? Yeah, lady here in the third row. The microphone's coming.
I mean, everything you're talking about is quite new to me, so it's probably quite a basic question for you. I'm just quite interested in this arising out of this Byzantine Persian era, and what do you think it was about that conflict, the civilization, what would happen to civilization that particularly needed Islam, or if you can look at it that way, what is it particularly?
For your first exposure to Islamic history, it's a very, very good question. And in a way, we were jumping forward. What happened is that all the provinces, Egypt, Syria, most of Anatolia, were devastated. And actually, it happens after the Prophet Muhammad's life. All of those cities were bored of the Persian and the Byzantine empires. They'd surrendered 5 or 6 times to rough armies that had destroyed many cities. When the first Arab armies came, and the Arabs were led by their merchant princes after the Prophet Muhammad died, and they were very good at writing documents and keeping to their word and telling them exactly what was going to happen. If you're not going to be a Muslim, you're going to pay a poll tax. We will protect you. You will be a second-class protected dhimmi, but you will not have to fight. We do that. We're Arabs and we're Muslims. We'll do the fighting, but we're going to look after you. And I've chronicled in southern Anatolia a whole succession of 6 great cities, very quick to make these arrangements, and also to see that paying the poll tax regularly delivered protection in a way that the old empires didn't. The other complexity is the Byzantine Empire was furious about all these other Christian faiths. And so the Copts in Egypt, a land that Anthony knows better than anybody in London, were actually delighted to be ruled by Muslim Arabs. They really hated the persecution of the Orthodox Byzantine Empire. And that happened in Syria as well. The Jacobites were being persecuted. The so-called Nestorians were also having a tough time from the Byzantines, and the Persians were giving an equal persecution. So the Muslim Empire expanded in a most extraordinary quick way after the Prophet's death, but it has, to my mind, no direct bearing on the incubation of the Quran or the first community.
No, but it is the subject of one of Barnaby's books called The Heirs of the Prophet. Any other questions? Yeah, hand up.
Is my audio clear?
Yeah.
So thank you so much for the whole session, sir. My interest in Islamic history has been very recent, and whatever conversations I've had is with my Muslim friends. And I'm a Hindu, but I don't go by what my conditionings are. So for the past 1 year, I've always had this burning questions about the essence of Islam and why is it important to humanity right now, because everything that I've learned after it is basically what the world has taught me around it. But I have never gotten to the essence of why Islam is so important, because every religion is trying to get there at the very thing itself. And why does Islam come off as a rule book sometimes where like you have to pray 5 times a day or not Allah would be angry at it? What's the essence of it behind all?
Thank you. What's the essence?
I totally agree with you. There is nothing special. There was a moment when I think everybody realized that a simplified Islam, like a Neoplatonic philosophy at the end of the classical world, had the potential to embrace everything, to be a sort of world religion, taking all our belief systems. You know, I'm a Christian surrounded by saints and all sorts of sort of structure between me and God. And there was a sort of, in the same way that Hinduism also has a clear single point in the end. And there was a hope that Islam could be this vast umbrella for us all. And I think that's been disappointed. And again, we don't want to go into that. There's a whole nother lecture, is about the corruption of Islam through power. And what happened, partly your question, after Prophet Muhammad, who was leading this very wonderful egalitarian self-help community, looking after widows, looking after orphans, feeding. Charity was an action that actually defined you as a Muslim, and protecting the weak. So wonderful community being born out of the desert.
Well, yeah, one of the pillars of Islam being the obligation to charity.
Absolutely, and paying this very small, modest tax of 2.5%, which we can all cope with, to cherish. There is this extraordinary expansion of the empire, the Umayyad Empire. Those who've been bored with Islamist friends will always notice there'll be a great green map of the Ummah of its farthest extent, including Tours in France and Samarkand and China. And I think this is the central heresy of Islam, is that many Muslims are obsessed by that empire that came after the Prophet Muhammad died and think that it's proof of God's support for their faith. When in fact, I think it's a thing that has corrupted Islam more than anything else, is wrapping up this faith with a sense that it actually is going to create an empire for us. That's a long, rambling answer to your good
I think we've got time for one more question.
May I? Yeah. Thank you. Fascinating conversation. And if I can be greedy, I'll do a two-part question. One is, you haven't mentioned this in your conversation, but there is the miraculous night journey from the rock in Jerusalem, where Prophet Muhammad goes and meets the other prophets. And what do you ascribe that to, or what are the lessons from that, and where do you place it in his revelations? And the second question, given the fact that you've written on Shia Sunni, is that when I was in Iran, I asked somebody, can you explain Shiaism, Shia religion to me, and where does it fit in Iran? And the answer I got still foxed me. The answer I got was a one-liner which said, the Shiite religion is Iran's revenge on Islam. Any comments?
Shia and Sunni is a wonderful, simple answer. It's all about authority. And Shiat Ali wishes Ali to be the successor. Not out of any choice. It's simply that on the day the Prophet Muhammad finishes his recitation of the Quran is the same day that he appoints Ali to be his successor. So if you're a Shiite, it's not a question of wondering if you should have a Jacobite or a Bourbon or a Caliph. God, as he ends the Quran, appoints a man, the twin of the Quran, to be the leader and to lead this community in its egalitarian purity, its compassion that I feel the Prophet Muhammad's household has. And with the Shia faith, there is an extraordinary sort of revolutionary zeal, not for conquests, not even for conversions, but to put that sort of egalitarian progress, push it through. That's their lost world that never happened. The Arabs are unfair about Shia. The Shia heartland that took the faith to Iran was the Jibal Amal in Lebanon, Bahrain, Al-Hassa in eastern Saudi Arabia. That is the true spiritual heartland that the Iranians in the 17th century got their scholars from, like the Al-Sadra family. But the Saudis are always trying to persuade everybody that Shia is just a Persian Zoroastrian heresy. I'm afraid it's totally wrong. I think the Shia has got a sort of magic honesty to those early years of the Prophet Muhammad's community. And your first question, I forgot.
Well, I think, unfortunately, time.
Jerusalem. One of my favourite figures that the Shia hate is Aisha, the young, beautiful, most lovely, gorgeous of the Prophet Muhammad's wives. She was there on the night journey and said, your body never left, and it was just in your mind. This is the mother of the believers who had more hadith credited to her than anybody else. She herself always said it was a spiritual journey. There are many Muslims who feel it was a physical, it was a magical journey, and you can make your choice, but I definitely follow Aisha on that. It's incredibly important for Muslim mysticism, the night journey, because the Prophet Muhammad has an extraordinary sort of spiritual adventure, and it codifies and protects those of us who are more mystically inclined, and the Prophet Muhammad has done it. So the ultra-Wahhabi Sunni have that moment where the Prophet goes to meet the other pre-Islamic prophets. And that perhaps, I know I should stop in a moment, but that is something that would be wonderful to keep hold of in the beauty of Islam, is cherishing all the 1,230,000 prophets that existed before him. So you've got almost a Hindu diversity of faith that is absolutely acknowledged by the Prophet Muhammad. There are more references to the Virgin Mary in the Quran than there are in the Gospels. Jesus is a miraculous, highly esteemed prophet in the Quran and in the Hadith. Very, very similar to the person we come across in the Gospels, St. Thomas. And I think I should stop now, but thank you for that question.
I think you
sir.
should. And one last thing before you go. We were going to sing this for you, because inspired by the music before, we did think we might sing something for you. But Barnaby, are you going to sing for us, Barnaby?
Anthony's been very cruel. I'm tone deaf. But I will not sing. But I've written this fourth book. This is for children.
Microphone.
Oops. So there's this rather... Whoops.
I have no idea what's coming.
This is a lovely publisher who wanted Anglo-Saxon British children to be less afraid of Islam, and so we published this book. So I'm just going to read my version of Surah 81, which I think gives a flavour of Islam clearer than anything else. The overturning. When the sun shall be folded up, and when the stars shall fall, and when the mountains shall be made to pass away, and when the camel 10 months gone with young shall be neglected, and when the wild beasts shall all be gathered together, and when the seas shall boil, and when the souls shall be joined, and when the young girl who was buried alive shall ask for what crime was she put to death, and when the book shall be laid open, and when the heaven shall be removed, and when hell shall burn fiercely, and when paradise shall be brought near, then every soul shall know what it hath wrought.
Thank you.